At a conference in July 1941, the Japanese leadership made the decision to go to war. Only a short time before, its troops had occupied the southern half of French Indochina, giving them the strategic launch point to conquer Southeast Asia and the Philippines. With Indochina in their hands, Japan now had airfields in range of Singapore, harbors only a few days steaming time away from the heart of the Dutch East Indies, and overland routes to Thailand and Malaya. President Roosevelt recognized the threat to American security by this Japanese move and knew it was time to act. He ordered all of Japan's assets in the U.S. frozen and immediate sanctions imposed. The sale of steel and scrap metal were suspended, as were all shipments of oil.
And now you are putting Japan on this hourglass, because now is to find alternative petroleum supplies, because now the U.S. market is being cut first back and then eventually cut off.
By August 1st, all Japanese-American trade came to a halt. Japan's leaders accused the United States of economic strangulation. With only 2 years' supply of oil in reserve, they realized immediate action had to be taken. They settled on a two-pronged strategy. First, a last-ditch diplomatic effort would be undertaken in an attempt to restore relations with the United States. While that was being conducted, however, the Army and Navy would make final preparations for the Southern offensive. The Japanese calculated that when they did strike the Dutch and British, the Americans would surely declare war against them. That presented a serious threat, for the American Pacific Fleet represented the only naval force that could thwart Japan's designs on Southeast Asia. In the spring of 1940, President Roosevelt had deployed the expanding United States fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, closer to the strategic places America would need to defend in the event of war: Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam.
We would say that this is a threat to the Japanese, but the Japanese see it as an opportunity. If they can neutralize the American Pacific Fleet, even for a period of time of no more than 6 months, that will allow them to complete their expansion in the Western Pacific Rim. And of course, then the American people, being a reasonable, rational people, we will then sit down and negotiate with the Japanese, who will be in a position of strength to resolve the outstanding issues in the Pacific.
Enter Admiral Yammamoto, commander of the Imperial Navy's combined fleet. Although opposed to war with the United States, he conceived a brilliant plan that would give Japan time to overrun Southeast Asia, drawing on events that had occurred in the Mediterranean just months before.
In November of 1940, the British had launched a highly successful carrier attack against the Italian battle fleet in the heel of the boot in Italy at Taranto Harbor. I think about 24 ferry Swordfish, which were antiquated biplane torpedo planes, sank one Italian battleship and badly disabled 3 cruisers. And that immediately redressed the situation whereby the British Royal Navy had been outnumbered and outgunned in the Mediterranean. So the Japanese took immediate note of that. They sent down their naval attaché to look at the damage. And we now know American intelligence was aware of Japanese interest in what had occurred at Taranto.
Yamamoto studied the Taranto raid and concluded that a surprise attack by the Imperial Navy's airmen could deal a severe blow to the American Pacific Fleet as it lay at anchor in its base at Pearl Harbor. Through mid-1941, his plan took shape. Like the Royal Navy's Taranto raid, Japan would use its best aircraft carriers for the operation. 6 flat tops carrying over 350 planes would move in from the north and launch a massive airstrike. With luck, Japan's primary obstacle would be eliminated in a single decisive stroke. For the operation to succeed, Yamamoto's pilots needed better weapons. torpedoes needed to be modified to run in shallow harbor conditions.
The torpedoes had a unique wooden box that was added to the back of the torpedo with a preset angle for the torpedo to enter the water with, and that once it hit the water, this served to keep the torpedo from hitting the bottom of the harbor.
Taisuke Maruyama was a 19-year-old naval aviator training for the attack on Pearl Harbor.
そうしますと10何メーターの水深ではね、
Pearl Harbor is shallow, about 10 to 12 meters deep at the most. When you drop a torpedo from an airplane at higher altitude, it goes into the water at an angle that might send it too deep for the conditions at Pearl. So we practice dropping from as low as possible.
可能な限り、高度低い低高度で
Next, the fleet's level bombers needed bombs capable of penetrating the heavily armored decks protecting the American battleships.
The Japanese Navy had determined that they could take naval artillery shells and they could put them on a lathe and make them aerodynamically shaped and then add a tail fin to them. If they were dropped from a certain altitude, they would penetrate the 5.5 inches of armor.
As the Japanese practiced for the Pearl Harbor attack, Tokyo dispatched a special envoy, Saburo Kurusu, to Washington in hopes of achieving some sort of diplomatic solution to the crisis.
Gentlemen, you all know how difficult my mission is, but I'll do all I can to make it a successful one for the sake of two countries, Japan and the United States.
Along with Ambassador Nomura, Kurusu presented Japan's final offer. They proposed that the United States officially recognize Japanese territorial gains in Asia, that normal trade relations be restored between Japan and the United States, and that America cease all support for China.
And the U.S. government won't make the deal because they're really relying on Chiang Kai-shek to at least occupy the Japanese. And if we make this deal, there is always Chiang Kai-shek's sanction, which is I'll collapse, I'll surrender.
The Japanese initiative was summarily dismissed, and in return, the United States demanded that Japan evacuate French Indochina.
The Japanese simply cannot withdraw from French Indochina without losing face. They cannot continue to operate indefinitely without American resources or replacing those resources from some other source.
Unwittingly, the United States had pushed Japan just one step closer to finalizing their fateful plan. The United States military had developed a plan of its own in case war broke out.
There were 5 rainbow plans, and they outlined a variety of contingencies. Would we have allies? Would we be alone? Would we fight in the Pacific, offensively defend in the Atlantic, or fight an offensive in the Atlantic or European war and defend in the Pacific?
Rainbow 5 specifically dealt with the Japanese-initiated war. It would have the Pacific Fleet head for the Philippines, stopping along the way to capture bases in the Marshall and Caroline Islands. Not until the Philippines were reached was a decisive naval engagement anticipated.
And the mental assumption that guided American thinking about Pearl Harbor was that the fleet defended the place. And as long as the fleet was there, Pearl Harbor was safe. So when the crisis of 1941 escalated towards war, Americans naturally assumed that the Japanese would strike weakness rather than strength, and that Pearl Harbor is the last place they would think of going.
In October of 1941, hardline militarist Hideki Tojo came to power. He ordered negotiations to continue even as final preparations for war were completed. By November, the Pearl Harbor strike force was trained and ready for action. Fleet units rendezvoused in the remote Kuriil Islands, waiting for the order to execute the attack. In Washington, Nomura and Kurusu continued to negotiate with the Secretary of State, but Hull knew that the Japanese were up to something. American cryptologists had broken Japan's diplomatic code and had been reading most of the messages sent to the Japanese ambassadors. Tokyo had given them until November 25th to complete negotiations. Then the Americans intercepted another message that, when decoded, sent shivers through Washington. The message extended the date to November 29th, but added, "The deadline absolutely cannot be changed. After that, things are automatically going to happen." For by November 29th, the Japanese strike force would be far at sea, under radio silence, and impossible to recall. Aboard the carrier Kaga, Takeshi Maeda soon learned his ultimate destination.
Nobody said anything about the war starting, of course. No mention of going to Pearl Harbor. I knew something was going on, but I didn't hear that we were going to Pearl Harbor until we were called together and told we were starting a war. They said some of us might not see our country again and told us to say goodbye to the land of Japan. I remember well how our captain said that. I thought to myself, my God, we're going to war with America.
最後のお別れをしなさいと。